Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding, the podcast. I'm Roland, this is Matt, and we're busy taking a sort of walk through wisdom in the Old Testament. So far, just to catch us up briefly, we've questioned the idea of wisdom literature as a category. So we said, okay, let's just chuck that out and think about wisdom in a more sort of fluid, interconnected way within the Old Testament, right? Then we were like, cool, well, a good place to start then, if we're going to do that, or kind of release the shackles a little bit in terms of how we think about wisdom, is to start with the figure of Solomon in 1 Kings 1-11. For one reason is that wisdom plays a huge role in the story of Solomon, the mythos of Solomon, if you will. And the second is that the two books that we're going to look at, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, they make efforts to connect themselves with Solomon in some way, either explicitly or implicitly. And so they clearly have, well, that's an indication that they have the story of Solomon sort of sitting in the background of their sort of discourse.
It sort of makes sense that these books that have a whole lot to say about wisdom are going to call the epitome of wisdom in Israel's history to mind.
Exactly. So we took a look at that, and we saw there that the idea of wisdom and the fear of the Lord the relationship between them isn't as obvious as we would have thought, right? They're not identical, because Solomon is wise and yet he doesn't fear the Lord. And so then there's like, okay, what does that mean, right? So that brings into question, kind of destabilizes maybe an idea that we would have about wisdom. Then we spent an episode looking at the fear of the Lord. So we saw that it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's called upon us both in the New and the Old Testament. That's like a constant thing throughout the Bible. And there's different ways of understanding it. So sometimes fear can be a bad thing. But in the case of God, fear is a good thing. It keeps us sort of healthily away from our own degradation, if you will, like our own desire, our own like tendency to abandon the God we love. To use I think that's from a song, right?
Yeah,
there's like a hymn or something like that.
It's now like right down to the tongue, and I can't think of it.
But anyway, so that
Come Thou Fount.
That one. So we saw fear of the Lord in general there. Now we're going to sort of move to look at our first book. So it's going to be Proverbs. And what are we looking at in Proverbs as we start?
Right. So sort of drawing those threads together, we've looked at wisdom, we've looked at the fear of the Lord, and the motto of the book of Proverbs is there in Proverbs 1 verse 7, Proverbs 9 verse 10. It's sort of called to mind again at the end of the book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we already raised some questions around that with Solomon's story. So we're gonna start by just thinking about the relationship between those two things in the first section of Proverbs. We're going to focus in on Proverbs 1-9 and interrogate that.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't familiar with, or as familiar with Proverbs as you,
sure,
why do you isolate 1-9 out of the 31 chapters or whatever?
Right, yeah. So Proverbs, the way that Roland Murphy has spoken about it,
I thought you were going to say me.
Roland Murphy, who's done a lot of work on Old Testament wisdom. He's written commentaries on Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and books and articles and all that. And he's made the comment that Proverbs is probably the most neatly organized book in the Bible.
Okay, bold claim.
Yeah, but it sort of makes sense because it's got headings to tell us where the new sections begin. So it starts with the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And then in the beginning of chapter 10, these are the Proverbs of King Solomon. Later on, it talks about the words of the wise. A bit further on, these are the Proverbs of Solomon collected by the men of Hezekiah. These are the words of Agur, the words of Lemuel's mother. So at all these different points along the way in this book, we're actually given headings to say, this is the beginning of a new section. So that's the one reason. We've actually got a section here in the beginning that is between two headings.
Okay.
The second reason is that with this section in particular, we've got something different going on. When you look at with the sort of literature, the sort of genre that the book of Proverbs is known for are those sort of two-line sayings.
Yeah.
The sort of things that we usually think of as Proverbs. A rolling stone gathers no moss. That's a short little quip there.
Is that one of the Proverbs?
Not in the book of Proverbs, no, but it's a proverb that is...
I was trying to figure out theological significance of that.
But I mean,
Yeah.
we're sort of accustomed to the idea of what a proverb is. And it's these little truisms that make sense of reality or give us a principle to live by or what have you. Short, the idea is that it's short. The idea is that it's catchy. The idea is that we can rattle them off easily. And that's what the book of Proverbs has mainly been known for. So the plans of a person's heart, in a person's heart they plan their way, but it is Yahweh who establishes their steps. Short, easy to remember, apparently not for me. Easy to remember, but there's something weighty about that. There's something true about that. There's something that particular proverb I've come around to numerous times throughout my life. That I think I'm going one direction, and then it just seems like, oh no, actually the Lord had a different plan here. Not what I was expecting. It's like, well, actually, helpful reminder. A person's heart plans their way, but it's the Lord who establishes their steps. That makes up the vast majority of the book of Proverbs, not Proverbs 1 to 9. When we get to Proverbs 1 to 9, we have these longer poems, these more abstract reflections on not so much the nature of wisdom, although that, I guess, plays into it a little bit, but these longer exhortations to pursue wisdom, to pay attention to wisdom, and other things too.
Yeah, there's a constant refrain to like listen to God or listen to your parents or listen to others in order to gain wisdom. Like it's not obvious, and so like be attentive to the advice of others and things like that, which is almost like a preparation for what's about to come, right? Where you're about to hear all this advice and guidance from other people that we're going to name and give you, and go through. So yeah, okay.
So yeah, it does prepare the way, and it does give us a sense of it. At no point does it say this is what we mean by wisdom and sort of lay it out in abstract terms, but it does. We do get a sense of what wisdom entails by thinking about how it finds its context in these longer.
That's an interesting
instructions.
Actually, comment that you made there, and I think it ties into what we want to talk about in this episode, where it doesn't give us an account of wisdom. It doesn't. Like in Aristotle, he'll tell us, in his ethics, he'll tell us what he means by wisdom. And he'll tell us what he means by courage. And, and that's part of his whole project is to figure out like, okay, what do these things mean? And how do we articulate them? And how do we judge whether things are courageous or not, or cowardly or whatever? But that's not the case in Proverbs, right? In Proverbs, you have someone who's talking to a group of people, and they all kind of have a sense of what wisdom is, what the word means, right? Like maybe it's not precise, but it's like most things that we, in normal discourse, would.
The way we use words in everyday language, like if you could use a word 100 times and still be like, hey, what does that mean? And then you have to scratch your head
really
and
think about it.
How would I actually define that? Good question.
Yeah. So
be that sort of thing.
Okay, so in that case, then he's not necessarily trying to give an account of wisdom either. But he is trying to tell us that there's a relationship between wisdom on the one hand, which we have an intuitive grasp of, and the fear of the Lord on the other hand, which we also have an intuitive grasp of. Hopefully we have a more intuitive grasp now that we've sort of relieved some of the baggage from in the previous episode. Okay, that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, I think.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I think maybe it's worth just spending a bit of time talking about what does wisdom entail. It doesn't come out with a straightforward definition, but what can we gather from the way that wisdom is spoken about in these opening chapters of Proverbs?
Well, the thing that strikes me is that what strikes me the most when I read 1 to 9 is that it's not obvious. It's not like you're born with wisdom or that it's instinctive. In fact, a lot of the time, I mean, I know in Ecclesiastes this happens, but here as well, it's contrasted with following your heart. Where I imagine by following your heart, they mean like kind of just go with your passions, that your unexamined passions, and just go ahead with your and to do whatever you want kind of thing, right? Whereas wisdom involves you having to learn from others. It involves having to like internalize this. I'm still not getting actually to what wisdom is, but I guess I'm saying like something about it, right? It's that it involves like internalizing these lessons that have been accumulated over generations, or that God has, the Creator Himself has like encoded in His Torah for us. So it's about looking outside and then like putting a check on those unexamined passions. It was examining them, and finding pleasure in the best things, and avoiding things that are like sort of only have the appearance of pleasure, but actually in the end aren't like, I don't know, they aren't full, or they aren't rich in terms of their source of goodness and things.
Yeah.
That, I think that's the thing that strikes me the most, especially in 1 to 9, is just that it's basically, if I were to summarize it, it's not obvious, it's not instinctive, it's something you have to learn and grow in. And that involves you having to look to people who you think would be the best sources of learning that from.
Yeah. So Stuart Weeks has explained wisdom this way. To become wise, one had to learn. And to learn the right things properly was to become wise. And so in that sense, we could talk about wisdom as a sort of relative term. What determines what is wise actually depends on whose instruction you're listening to, or what's, I guess, deemed authoritative. What are the right things? What determines the right things to learn? Which, before we delve into how Proverbs deals with that, it is worth just pointing out that that's what we saw when we looked at 1 Kings 1 to 11. So if you remember from the previous episodes, we had wisdom that could be directed towards covenant faithfulness, the fear of the Lord, the sorts of things that we would associate with that. But it could also be directed towards setting up, well, the way that Solomon actually directed it. It could be directed towards setting up an impressive kingdom that, in Solomon's case, was in diametric opposition to the blueprint that Yahweh laid out for him in Deuteronomy 17.
Right, so he was listening to the wisdom ideals of the ancient Near East, but not necessarily the wisdom ideals that come from God and yeah, okay.
Yeah, so one of the things that we saw is that wisdom is effectively defined by its telos. It's defined by its orientation. So in the case of Solomon's wisdom, what the narrative sort of implies in the beginning is that the hope is that he's going to direct his wisdom towards the fear of Yahweh. Instead, though, he directs it towards, and so it takes as its foundation, takes as its defining characteristics the ancient Near Eastern royal ideal that we see in other ancient Near Eastern nations like Assyria or what have you.
Okay, so that kind of explains how wisdom can be a tool. It's like this ability to listen to and grow in skill in something.
Yeah.
And like, depending on who you listen to. So that's an interesting thing. So it's not just that you have to listen to others because you have to learn it, but it's also that you have to listen to the right people.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's why in Proverbs 1 to 9, you often see him saying, okay, well, listen to your parents, who presumably, and the same parents telling you to listen to the Lord. So it's the parents who already fear the Lord, and then the Lord himself in the Torah. That's like the starting point of your wisdom. Like, listen to those people. I mean,
listen to those people and not the foreign woman.
Oh, yeah.
Not the band of thugs that we meet in chapter 1.
Right.
We'll talk about them next in one of the next episodes. So it's getting straight. Who should we listen to here? Who actually has that authority to speak? And so when we come to Proverbs 1, what we see is that wisdom goes hand in hand with Torah. That's not completely obvious from a first read of Proverbs, and certainly hasn't been obvious if you've read what scholars have been arguing for over the past number of years, decades, better part of a century, maybe longer.
I know you said to me that sometimes people, or you've mentioned to me in the past that sometimes people think about Proverbs as very, like, not in the context of the covenant.
Yes.
And this came up a bit, I guess, in our first discussion, our first episode, where we spoke about how like the idea of wisdom literature came out of this thing to like de-Jewify. That's not a word, but you know what I mean. De-Judaize parts of the Old Testament so that we could have a more like universal philosophical principle.
Yeah.
But it does. I mean, when you read through Proverbs 1-9, when it talks about the instruction of the Lord that you're supposed to listen to, that this hero is supposed to listen to, I'm like, well, where is this instruction of the Lord? Like, what are you expecting? Because you don't get something like that in. Okay, well, I'm skipping ahead, but like in Ecclesiastes, you don't get something like that as much, right? Where like he's not saying go listen to the Torah of the Lord or whatever. It's like he has to get at it in a different way. Whereas here, constantly, it's like listen to your parents and listen to the Lord, and it's like, well, I know how to listen to my parents, but like, where am I going to get the lessons from the Lord, right?
Yeah. So in Proverbs 2, this is one example. Like you said, there is sort of this refrain that happens all the way through, where at the beginning of each section of Proverbs 1-9, you've got this injunction: my son, listen to the commands, listen to the instruction, listen to the teaching listen to my wisdom. That sort of injunction to pay attention is there all the way through. But Proverbs 2, my son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight, cry aloud for understanding, if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord. So just focusing in on those first 4 verses, we see firstly that wisdom and the instruction of the parents go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
There's sort of, if you do this, if you do this, if you do this, and like it switches from the instruction of the parents to paying attention to wisdom, but the same point is being made.
Yeah.
Secondly, if we look elsewhere at how these sorts of things are called to mind, or how these injunctions to pay attention, how these look, let's flip over to Proverbs 6. Proverbs 6:20. My son, keep your father's command. Don't forsake your mother's teaching. That word there for teaching is one that's quite familiar. It's Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Bind them always on your heart. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they'll watch over you. When you awake, they'll speak to you. For this command is a lamp, this teaching a light, and correction and instruction are the way to life, keeping you from the foreign woman. And so it launches into the body of that instruction. But that language there, that's straight out of Deuteronomy. If we flip over to Deuteronomy 6, I think we can see that quite clearly. So here's the Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone. Love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These are the commands I give you today to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children, which I guess also calls to mind that father-son, mother-son dynamic that we see in Proverbs 1-9. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands. Bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. It's very much the same.
They need to be everywhere. They constantly need to be reminders around you.
Yeah.
Whether they're like on your body or like around your house or whatever. Yeah.
Put it everywhere, that you do not forget this Torah, that you do not forsake Yahweh and go your own way, worship other gods, and slip down the slope to apostasy.
Yeah.
But Proverbs is picking up all that same language. How can we not see the parents' instruction as effectively Torah?
I never thought of that parent thing where he's, because in Deuteronomy and even in Exodus, like a lot of the things in Israel, it's about like make sure your kids understand, right? Like, I mean, in the Passover, it's like when your child asks you what's going on, tell them that this is why, all the way back in Exodus like 12 or whatever.
Yeah.
And that very dynamic is what's like we're situating ourselves in here in Proverbs constantly.
Yeah.
I never saw that. That's cool.
I think in the command to honor your parents in the 10 Commandments, that is the dynamic that's going on. So that you will live long in the land.
Yeah.
Why would they live long in the land from obeying their parents? Well, it isn't just a direct cause effect that if you do this, then that's going to happen to you. Maybe there's some of that, but there's a very intuitive level on which we can interpret that if parents who fear the Lord instruct their children in the ways of the Lord, a lot like what we've got here in Deuteronomy 6, then they will remain faithful to the covenant, and you won't see the covenant curses at the end of Deuteronomy or at the end of Leviticus come to pass, where God's like, I've had enough of you. You have not been faithful to my covenant. You've just done your own thing, and so off you go.
Yeah, I know.
What happened?
I know we might get into this in the next episode, but even the talk of the land comes up in Proverbs, doesn't it?
Yeah,
in
but the end
chapter
Proverbs,
2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to read those verses?
Okay, so Proverbs 2 verse 20 to 22 says, so you will walk in the way of the good and keep the paths of the righteous. This is assuming you're listening to God and your parents. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it.
Yeah.
Which is like, that's the covenant promises at the end of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Like,
Straight out of Deuteronomy. In fact, there's some fairly unusual language that's going on there. The idea of being rooted out of the land is something that's quite particular to Deuteronomy.
okay.
So the fact that Proverbs is picking that up or using that particular word to root out of the land.
Because the idea is that you're established in the land,
Powerful.
you know, like a tree, like plants their roots, and then like now we're going to rip you out. So it's like, okay, you've been given the promised land, but I'm going to take it away from you if you don't like live with me in this covenant that you promised to live with. Yeah.
Yeah. So just as an aside, so we can connect some of the dots here. What we've got in Proverbs 2 is something of a table of contents for Proverbs 1 to 9 as a whole.
In Proverbs 2, we have a table of contents of Proverbs 1 to 9. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
The various sections of Proverbs 2 map onto the argument that's being made all through Proverbs 1 to 9. So in verses 1 to 4, we've got this block of injunctions to pay attention, to listen, and we saw how wisdom and Torah went hand in hand there. In verses 5 to 11, effectively, you could break that up further, but 5 to 11, we've got the formation of what sort of character will result from paying attention to Torah, and that will be the fear of the Lord. That'll be ethical character,
Righteousness, justice. Yeah.
And then into the second half, it's quite neatly organized in that you've got two even halves. The second half, verses 12 through 15. 12 through 15, you've got the wicked men, which map onto another set of characters that we see elsewhere in Proverbs 1, Proverbs 4, a little bit in Proverbs 3, not very strongly, but sort of there.
Mm-hmm.
The foreign woman in the next few verses 12 through 19. And that again maps onto a key theme in the book. Proverbs 5 through 7 deal in quite some detail with this character of the foreign woman.
Mm-hmm.
And then right at the end there, we've got those verses about remaining in the land. So the argument there summarizes what's going on in Proverbs 1 to 9. If you pay attention to wisdom, then you will become the sort of person that Yahweh wants you to be, that you'll fear the Lord your God and walk in his ways.
Mm.
And in becoming that sort of person, then you will be equipped, having imbibed wisdom, then you will be able to steer clear of the foreign woman, to steer clear of these evil thugs that are going to try and rope you into their devious schemes.
Mm-hmm.
And by extension, you will remain in the land.
Preserve your life in the land, yeah.
And not be kicked out. So that's the first thing that I think, the first big thing that I think we should see from Proverbs 1 to 9, that it's this big push for the audience to pay attention to Yahweh's commands, to pay attention to Torah. And
that's not just general
where
ethics.
wisdom fits in.
So not just general ethics that you could get, but specifically like it's within the context of the Jewish covenant that like God has set up with his people. Yeah.
That's what it looks like to be wise, according to Proverbs 1 to 9.
Okay. And how does that... Okay, so... And we've already touched on fear of the Lord there.
There might have been a surprise there in Proverbs 2.
Yeah.
If you pay attention to wisdom,
Yeah. Then you will understand the fear of the Lord.
Then you will understand the fear of the Lord. So
Which seems backwards from
wisdom, which leads to the fear of the Lord.
Right. Which seems like the reverse of 1 verse 7 or 9 verse 10, which is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Isn't that weird? So then in the book's motto, we've got the fear of the Lord leading to wisdom.
Yeah, that's weird.
So when it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, how have you typically understood that?
Guiding principle? The fear of the Lord is the guiding principle of wisdom? Like, or basis? It's like the thing on which you build wisdom, I guess. Anyway, to be honest with you, like, the word, the temporal notion of beginning has always been a bit weird. It's not like it's not like I would stop fearing the Lord when I get wisdom, right? So it's always been a bit difficult to articulate exactly what that word beginning is trying to get. But yeah, basis, I guess, or principle.
So it's worth just saying straight on the outset that word, that idea of the fear of the Lord as the basis of wisdom is possibly one of the more popular proposals.
I've seen it. I mean, that's the one when I've gone to read people being like, do you have a better idea? And typically they say something like principle or basis or something.
Yeah. So that, I think, is certainly in our circles, I think, has been one of the most popular. The difficulty with that is the basis of wisdom. We need to get a little bit technical here. Now, the word for beginning in Proverbs 1 verse 7 is the Hebrew word reshit.
Okay.
Which is more ambiguous. It has a bit more range of meaning, which we'll come back to in a second. The word in 9 verse 10 is tequila, which is less ambiguous. It has less wiggle room.
Tequila.
Tequila.
Tequila. I see. Okay. That makes more sense.
Always takes a temporal meaning.
Okay.
So that sort of throws a spanner in the works for thinking about the fear of the Lord as the basis of wisdom.
Yeah.
Now, even with Reshit, I think we've got issues with the fear of the Lord as the basis of wisdom. There actually, as far as I can tell, there isn't an instance of the word Reshit in the Old Testament where it means anything like principle or basis or grounding.
Oh wow. Okay.
So if we're going,
wait, is it one of those words that only comes up like 4 times?
I don't know. It comes up plenty.
Oh, okay.
In the beginning, God created the heavens.
Oh.
Bereshit bara Elohim et
right. Okay.
Ha'aretz.
Right. Okay.
That word there, beginning, it's
temporal, probably.
If we're going to choose between those ones, it's temporal.
Okay.
I think we've got an underlying assumption though between, whichever of those we were to choose, there is still a further underlying assumption there that if we choose temporal, there's still this understanding that we're talking about wisdom as the fear of the Lord as the source of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the beginning of wisdom in that the fear of the Lord brings it about.
Yeah, you start out fearing the Lord, and then at some point you get some wisdom.
Right. Yeah, that's the idea. There is, however, another way that we can understand this.
Okay.
Both words for beginning, reshit and tequila, are often used not so much as a thing's source in the Old Testament, but as the first event in a series, effectively.
Okay.
So if we've got the passage of time, then it's the first event along that timeline that we're identifying.
That kind of fits with that language of in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. I mean, I know he's also the source of everything, but
God is the source.
God is the source, yeah, not the.
But in that sentence, what would be the source?
Yeah.
If beginning was talking about the source, what?
Yeah, because there we kind of have the timeline of his actions, right? And his interaction with humanity. And they were saying, okay, the first thing that happened in that timeline was that God created the heavens and the earth. Okay. Yeah. And so similarly it would be, we have it
along the journey of wisdom.
Oh, okay. The timeline now is wisdom. So along the journey of wisdom and growing and the pursuit of insight and all that stuff, fear of the Lord is the first
step. Yeah.
Okay.
The other way that this word's often used is to talk about first fruits of a harvest.
No way.
So tequila is used in Samuel to talk about the first fruits of a harvest. In Proverbs 3, it talks. Where is it now? The Proverbs 3 verse 9: honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, with the reshit of all your crops.
No, okay, cool.
So this idea of beginning as sort of the first instance of, the first fruits of, the first indication of wisdom.
Right, so you're pursuing wisdom. The pursuit of wisdom is more fundamental. You're saying, okay, I'm going to go on the journey of wisdom.
Yes.
And then the first milestone, I guess, or the first milestone, outcome of that,
the first piece of evidence,
will be the fear of the Lord.
Yeah, and intuitively, I think that makes sense. That if we're defining wisdom in line with the Torah, if we're associating these things and saying that what we're grounding wisdom on or defining wisdom in terms of is the instruction of Yahweh, as we find in particularly a book like Deuteronomy, then we would expect the first real evidence of that, the first sign that you have imbibed wisdom, is that we're seeing you fear the Lord.
Right.
And we're seeing this response of everything that we spoke about in the previous episode start to come to be and start to take over your life. And that's not a first instance that we move on to the next thing. That then characterizes the whole journey from then on.
But I thought we said that wisdom isn't necessarily going to produce fear of the Lord.
Isn't necessarily.
Okay.
But coming back to the first part of our discussion, that if Solomon could have taken wisdom down the avenue of the fear of the Lord, but instead took it down the avenue of the ancient Near Eastern royal ideal, what that comes to in each case is which voices he's listening to, which authority he's basing it on.
Okay.
So wisdom defined in terms of the ancient Near Eastern royal ideal is going to come with a whole different set of outcomes than wisdom that is based on Torah.
Okay.
And that again is defined in terms of its telos.
So, okay. So when he says here, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, he's almost saying the fear of the Lord is the first instance of the kind of wisdom that you want.
Yes, yeah. So, and actually that hits on a really important point, that what Proverbs is doing is not defining wisdom for us. It's not giving us a tractate.
Fell into the trap that I said we shouldn't fall into. Yes.
It's not giving us a tractate of this is what wisdom is in all its various nuances.
Yes.
What it's doing is saying, pursue the fear of Yahweh. Pursue the covenant ideal that was set forth in Deuteronomy that is meant to define you as a people.
Yeah.
That's meant to define every individual that makes up that people. It's an instance of parents instructing their children in the ways of the Lord. And we need to take it with that sort of rhetoric. So we're not going to get emotive.
Yeah. Man, it's crazy. Like after 20 minutes of talking about how it's situated within the covenant, I still was drawn to reading it outside of that context.
Yeah, it's quite a break from the way that we get accustomed to reading this book.
Okay,
that's quite a mold to break out of this. I mean,
yeah.
So that's what I think we see even just within Proverbs. If we pay attention to what that word beginning typically means, if we pay attention to the way that's presented, Proverbs 2 is the clearest.
Yeah, so that makes that reading allows you to very naturally make sense of Proverbs 1 and Proverbs 2.
Yeah.
Whereas the basis, the source, those principle, it's difficult for me to figure out how you would make sense of both Proverbs 1 and 2.
Yeah. And there's been no shortage.
Despite that's in it. Sorry, sorry to interrupt you, but that's besides the point you made already, where these words just aren't used in the way that we would need them to be used when reading them like that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's been no shortage of proposals. So you've got somebody like Michael Fox, who talks about wisdom, the fear of the Lord as fear of punishment in the early stages of education, and then fear of the Lord effectively as conscience in the later stages, as a sort of technical term for conscience. And so in the early stages, you've got the fear of punishment that brings about wisdom. And then as you move on your education, you've got wisdom that brings about this more lofty idea of the fear of the Lord as conscience.
Right.
You've got Ryan O'Dowd, who similarly, he carves it up a bit differently, but also talks about different stages of one's education. You've got effectively an upward spiral that from the fear of the Lord comes wisdom, which then leads to the fear of the Lord, which then leads to further wisdom. So it's an upward spiral of
it's like a positive feedback loop between the two. Yeah.
You've got Knut Heim, who talks about the way that Reshit is actually a very ambiguous term at the beginning. So he entertains the possibility that it could mean beginning as in source, or it could mean beginning as in principle or basis. And at that early stage, we're not really clear. Proverbs 2 gives us a different perspective, and then Proverbs 9 verse 10 circles back around to the earlier perspective, just with a little bit more clarity, and that's using the temporal term, not the more ambiguous one. And so we're invited to consider different perspectives as we read. I wonder why the author of Proverbs would have wanted to obfuscate the reader, but anyway. There you go. So my point just being that there are three, but there have been plenty of proposals for how we might work with those as two different things. But
we're all trying to make sense of this apparent tension.
Yeah.
But then your reading just says, oh, well, there is no tension.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is that actually they're saying the same thing in different words.
Okay.
So the first reason is that it's more consistent with what we see in Proverbs. Proverbs 1 and Proverbs 2 would make a hell of a lot more sense if they would just say the same thing.
Yeah.
Secondly, it becomes more apparent that they are saying the same thing in different words if we pay a bit more attention to the way that the language, the way that the particular words, particularly that word beginning, is used elsewhere. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, but also elsewhere just in Proverbs 1 to 9. Thirdly, which we haven't come to yet, but which I think I want to just mention as we land the plane, is that this follows the pattern that we see in Deuteronomy. We already mentioned that the instruction, this idea of instructing your children in the ways of the Lord, the fact that wisdom is interwoven with that same sort of schema, it's very reminiscent of and very much calling to mind Deuteronomy. But actually, if we go to Deuteronomy and we look at the way the fear of the Lord appears there, all the way through, consistently through Deuteronomy, what we see is that it's the instruction of Yahweh which leads to an appropriate response of the fear of the Lord and the people.
Okay.
We can see that in Deuteronomy 6. Let's just... there we can see it in a bunch of places, but let's just look at Deuteronomy 6 as we cover.
Well, I believe you, but I had a question. Do you mind if I ask a question? I realize we're running a bit over time here, but when you talk about it being in the beginning, is it in some way left behind when you progress past the beginning?
Oh, no. So, like I mentioned earlier, it's the first evidence of it, but not in that we can then move on to the next thing, right? In that it characterizes the journey from that point onwards.
Yeah,
and it will fill itself out in obedience, which again we see in Deuteronomy, that the fear of the Lord also is connected with keeping God's commands and walking in His ways and all these different things.
Yeah, I like the way you said first fruits earlier, and I think that's an interesting sort of metaphor for it, right? Because it's saying it's not like when you have your first fruits that like the rest of the season is going to be a completely different fruit.
Yeah,
that ignores that first fruit, right?
Yeah.
That's just the first taste of it that you will then see throughout. Like you'll see it work throughout the rest of that season. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's beginning in that sense. Cool. Okay.
And that is what we see in Deuteronomy. Okay. So these are the commands, this is Deuteronomy 6 now. These are the commands, the decrees, the laws that the Lord your God directed me to teach you, to observe in the land which you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children may fear the Lord your God, as long as you live by keeping His decrees and commands that I give you, so that you'll enjoy long life.
That's interesting, yeah.
That's exactly what we saw in Proverbs.
Yeah. You got the instruction, pursuit of wisdom, from the instruction of God leading to fear. Yeah.
For what it's worth, I think, so there in verse 1, this is the command. The NIV sort of flattens it out there to say that these are the commands, and connect it up with the decrees and the laws that afterwards. The Hebrew actually has a singular noun there. This is the command.
Okay.
Which I think, along with following a number of people much cleverer than me, is referring forward to the Shema in verses 4 and 5.
Okay.
This is the command. This is the central thing that you'll listen, O Israel. Yahweh is our God. Yahweh learn. So you will devote yourself wholeheartedly to him.
All right. I think we're going to end it there. So thanks for joining us for our first episode in Proverbs. We're going to continue looking at Proverbs in the next episode. I won't tell you what it is yet because I don't know what it is yet, and I don't want to give spoilers. So we'll see you there. Thanks for listening to the episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please do click the like and subscribe button with the bell. I don't know everything that's there.
And we're also on your favorite podcast platform now. So you can find us on Spotify, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts. And if there are any others that you know about that you want to see us on, just drop us a message and we can see about getting onto there too. Awesome. Thanks for joining us.